By early 1945, World War II in Europe was nearing its conclusion. Nazi Germany was militarily collapsing under the combined pressure of the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, yet tensions between the United States and the USSR were already visible, foreshadowing the Cold War. In this counterfactual scenario, the United States abruptly abandons its alliance with Britain, and the Soviet Union aligns itself with Germany and turns its immense military power eastward. While such a reversal would have been extraordinarily unlikely, examining it illuminates the strategic, moral, and political realities that shape the post-war world. For the United States to join forces with Germany at this late stage of the war, a sequence of radical political shifts would have been required. Allied unity would have had to fracture completely, driven by an overwhelming fear that Soviet forces intended to dominate all of Europe. Germany would likely have needed to remove Adolf Hitler, replacing him with a military or conservative civilian government capable of negotiating with the West. The principle of unconditional surrender would have been abandoned, along with plans for denazification and war crimes trials. Even under these circumstances, American public opinion, hardened by years of propaganda portraying Nazism as a mortal evil, would have been deeply hostile. Only the perception of the Soviet Union as an immediate and existential threat could have overridden that resistance. Militarily, the alignment would have created a strange and unstable coalition. The United States possessed unmatched industrial capacity, global logistics, overwhelming air power, and, by August 1945, a monopoly on atomic weapons. Germany, though battered and short on fuel, transport, and manpower, still fielded millions of experienced soldiers and maintained advanced weapons programs, including jet aircraft and rockets. The Soviet Union, however, stood at the height of its wartime power, with roughly 11 million troops, enormous armored formations, control of Eastern Europe, and an army hardened by years of brutal combat. The Red Army had already broken the Wehrmacht at immense cost and was advancing with confidence and momentum. The opening phase of such a war would likely have involved an abrupt halt to Western Allied advances and a rapid redeployment of forces eastward. German units that had been retreating or surrendering would be rearmed, reorganized, and placed under American logistical and operational supervision. Former Wehrmacht formations, with their experience on the Eastern Front, would serve as the primary ground forces, while the United States and Britain would dominate the air and supply networks. The immediate objective would be to push Soviet forces out of Germany and Poland, and to establish a defensible line in Central or Eastern Europe. Yet the Red Army of 1945 was not the broken force of 1941. It was powerful, confident, and deeply entrenched, making any rapid Western success unlikely. The Soviet response would almost certainly have been swift and uncompromising. Stalin would interpret the alliance as confirmation that Western capitalism and fascism were united in a war of annihilation against socialism. The USSR would likely launch massive offensives toward the Rhine before American and German forces could fully coordinate, mobilize reserves, and intensify both military and political warfare. Speed, mass, and destruction would take precedence over concerns about occupation or diplomacy, and the conflict would quickly escalate into one of unprecedented ferocity. The most decisive and dangerous factor in this scenario would be the American atomic monopoly. The use of nuclear weapons against Soviet troop concentrations or major cities such as Minsk, Kiev, or even Moscow could devastate Red Army formations and disrupt Soviet command structures. However, employing atomic bombs against a recent ally would fundamentally alter global perceptions of the United States, casting it as a power willing to deploy weapons of mass destruction for geopolitical dominance. Even then, a handful of nuclear strikes might not have forced Soviet surrender, given the USSR's demonstrated willingness to endure extraordinary losses. Instead, such attacks would likely accelerate Soviet efforts to develop their own nuclear weapons under conditions of total wartime urgency. The most plausible outcome of this conflict would be a prolonged and catastrophic stalemate. Front lines might stabilize somewhere in Central or Eastern Europe, turning the continent into a permanent battlefield. Civilian casualties would be immense, infrastructure would be obliterated, and even the United States would face severe economic and political strain from sustaining such a war. A Western victory was conceivable only if nuclear weapons were used extensively, and German forces were fully integrated into a US-led command structure, potentially forcing the Soviet Union into a negotiated settlement and collapsing its influence in Eastern Europe. Yet such a victory would be morally compromised, politically unstable, and likely followed by endless insurgencies, global outrage, and long-term instability. Conversely, if coordination failed or public support in the West collapsed, the Red Army might have broken through into Western Europe, enabling communist governments to emerge from France to Italy and forcing the United States into a defensive posture across the Atlantic. Regardless of the immediate military outcome, the long-term consequences would have been bleak. The survival, even temporarily, of a Nazi-aligned Germany would have poisoned the moral legitimacy of Western democracy. Decolonization movements across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East would likely have aligned themselves with socialism in opposition to a perceived U.S. fascist axis. The United Nations might never have formed, or would have been rendered meaningless, and the development of international human rights norms would have been delayed or derailed entirely. The Cold War, instead of remaining largely indirect, would have begun as an open and devastating World War III. In this light, an American-German alliance against the Soviet Union in 1945, while theoretically imaginable under extreme circumstances, would have been strategically reckless, morally catastrophic, and globally destabilizing. The actual post-war settlement, for all its flaws, avoided an immediate superpower war and allowed Europe to rebuild rather than be consumed by another round of total conflict. The decision not to fight the Soviet Union in 1945 may therefore stand as one of the most consequential acts of restraint in modern history.